Louis XIV did not live like a man. He did not think like a politician. He did not love like a mortal. He lived like a god who had chosen to descend, stepping onto earth, only so others might have the privilege of beholding him. He chose the sun as his symbol, not because it was beautiful, but because it had no rival. Apollo, the god of light art and classical masculine ideal, became the model he donned like a suit of radiant armour. But unlike others who merely imitated Louis, fully merged with that image. There was no longer a boundary between man and symbol. No more Louis and Apollo, only light, and he was the centre. He did not conceive time the way we do. Time was for commoners, those who must wait, endure, postpone to preserve appearances. Louis did not wait, because gods do not wait. If he desired something, a feast, a promenade, a moment of passion, the world had to move at his pace. If a woman stirred his longing desire could not be delayed by something as trivial as a stubborn ribbon. If his eyes settled on someone, that person ceased to be a free being, they became part of a play he directed. For him, desire was no sin, it was power. It was the declaration that he was alive, still worshipped, still commanding reality. He did not marry out of love. He did not invite anyone to his bed out of gratitude. Everything was ritual, a ritual confirming that he could. You might call it indulgence. But to him, it was the natural order of life revolving around an absolute centre. A focal point no one dared look away from, just as no one dares switch off the light while the sun still shines. And when desire, power, light and ego can no longer be compressed into one human being, they require a physical form to be expressed to the world. They demand mirrors to reflect them. They demand ceilings painted with gods, columns inlaid with gold, and hallways so long they force even kings to bow slightly as they walk. They demand Versailles. Versailles was not built to be lived in. It was not designed for comfort. Versailles was not a palace. It was a physical proclamation that Louis was God on earth. Imagine it a fog-heavy winter morning, the ground soft and sticky, as if the land itself were trying to swallow the footsteps of the one treading it. A man dressed in royal purple velvet, cloaked in silence, thick as layered sovereignty, needing no introduction, no guide, for he knew precisely where he was headed, and more importantly, he knew that everyone was watching him walk. And Versailles, the infamous swamp hours from Paris on horseback, groaned in its very soil, as if sensing it was about to become the foundation for a dream so mad, so unmatched, that no one would believe it until they saw it built. A dream dreamt by a man who likened himself to the sun, not for its light, but for its power to be seen, to be orbited, to be worshipped. Louis XIV stood there, gazing at his father's old hunting lodge, a modest, moss-covered structure no grander than a wrinkle on the forehead of history, and yet he did not see it as humble. He saw it as a beginning, a cornerstone for an empire of radiance, a root memory for a dynasty he would lift to its zenith, not through blood, but through architecture, through art, through overwhelming brilliance. And when an aging courtier nervously approached, mumbling about the soil's softness, the air's humidity, the inconvenience of transport and logistical costs, Louis said nothing. He merely glanced, then turned away, as though he had just heard the buzz of a mosquito, those infamous Versailles mosquitoes, before calmly uttering a line cold and sharp as a sword unsheathed. It is precisely because it is unsuitable that I have chosen this place. Nature does not command me. And thus Versailles began, not as architecture, but as a blazing, wordless manifesto, a will strong enough to flatten logic itself. Louis Lavaux was summoned, an architect whose blueprints were so magnificent they could make all of Europe pause for breath. His vision, a brand new palace, a clean slate. Tear down the old hunting lodge, erase every rustic trace, and construct something so majestic that if God himself happened to glance down, he might arch a celestial brow at the sheer audacity of it. But Louis shook his head. He didn't want a new palace. He wanted a world that revolved around memory. He insisted the old wooden lodge remain nestled in the heart of the grand project, like a heart tucked inside a golden ribcage, like a whisper passed from father to son that even marble must remember. And so Lavaux, whose talent matched his obedience, had to redraw everything. Versailles would not deny its past. It would swallow it whole and shine from within. While Lavaux sketched sinuous lines around a worn-out heart outside King Louis, had already ordered André Lenotre, the landscape designer he believed understood trees like monks understand scripture, to begin the divine project of crafting heaven from mud. And if you think gardening is just digging soil and sprinkling seeds, you clearly don't know Louis XIV. For him, waiting for trees to grow was an act of weakness. Versailles could not wait. So full-grown trees were uprooted from across France, roots wrapped delicately in cloth hoisted onto specially made horse-drawn carts, and hauled for weeks through countryside villages. Locals stared unsure whether someone noble was being buried or someone divine was being transported, for the trees were carried with more reverence than aristocratic corpses. And so Versailles became green not in years, but in one winter. It bloomed at the pace of tyranny. But trees were just the surface. Beneath them, Louis ordered the digging of dozens of kilometres of underground piping lead pipes, snaking over hills and under valleys to bring water from the Seine, because Versailles had no river, no lake, but it would have fountains. Because when a courtier strolled through the gardens, he had to hear the water sing as if Versailles itself could whisper, could seduce, could intimidate. The fountains weren't just decorative. They were a reminder if the king could make water flow against nature, then you dear nobleman should learn to bow before it breaks you. And as marble blocks were stacked into symmetry, as walls caught the last glint of sunset, as Venetian mirrors were smuggled in to reflect light into halos, as craftsmen died from lead poisoning or frostbite forgotten in history, Versailles took shape. Not as a home, but as a golden mask for absolute power. Every stone seemed to murmur, "You're looking at the impossible." And the impossible is real because the king wills it so. Soon Versailles was no longer a construction site. It was a way of life, a mechanism of control. The nobles were invited not to visit but to stay. Men who once had land soldiers and regional power were transformed into peacocks, fed by ceremony, addicted to attention, orbiting a throne where Louis dressed each morning before an audience not to cover his body, but to remind them this body is symbolic. Every movement is a policy. Versailles wasn't a palace, it was a stage, and there was only one lead actor, everyone else permanent spectators. From swampland to marble, Dream Versailles became not just the symbol of France, but a living reminder that when one man believes he is divine, and no one dares say no, even the mud must glitter like gold. And so, in a 17th century stained with blood, holy wars and rebellion, Louis XIV didn't need battles to dominate. He simply built a house. But one so unforgettable the world never recovered. Stepping into Versailles is like stepping into a fever dream with an unlimited budget. No, really. If you think a billionaire's wedding is ostentatious, Louis XIV is chuckling in his tomb. Right from the entrance hall, Versailles slaps you with ceiling height, so ridiculous you expect birds to echo before your own voice does. The columns are the size of smokestacks, but they aren't there to support the ceiling. They're there to support Louis's ego. He didn't want the ceiling to stand strong. He wanted it to feel awe. Then you turn into that hallway, the Hall of Mirrors. Everyone who passes through pauses, audibly exhales. This place doesn't just impress, it declares. With 357 mirrors reflecting the light from 357 windows, each step replicates you 357 times. And every version of you is looking up at a ceiling where Louis rides a horse into the heavens like Apollo himself, surrounded by gods of war, peace, and whatever else exists to serve him. This is a space where even light must ask Louis for permission before it touches your face. Versailles does not tolerate wild light. It only accepts the royal filter. You think he stopped at light. Oh no. You just passed a door, turned left, and boom, you're in the Queen's chambers, swallowed by embroidery, silk, hand-stitched patterns and gemstones, imported from every empire that dared call itself important. Legend has it the curtain makers here were so obsessed with detail they embroidered in their sleep. Every wall is like a couture ball gown, and you, a mere mortal, may only admire. Then comes the king's bedroom, or let's be honest, his fashion runway and daily political broadcast. You think I'm joking? Louis literally got dressed here in front of a live studio audience called the nobility. Dozens would stand around just to see him put on his socks. The noble who handed him his undershirt instantly gained 3 ranks. Power in Versailles was handed out by touching Louis's laundry. Who needs parliament? Deeper in you enter the garden maze, but don't think picnic. No. This is a maze designed to stun. The trees are clipped like military haircuts. Fountains are arranged like dopamine traps. Look left, bronze lion. Look right, Cupid. Look up, Louis again in stone pointing as if telling the clouds where to go. And remember, every tree here was stolen, uprooted and dragged in because Versailles didn't have nice trees. But Louis didn't care. If Versailles lacked a forest, he would borrow one. Beautiful trees, uproot them. No water. Redirect rivers. Rivers don't flow here, bend them. Versailles wasn't just a building. It was a message carved in marble flung into the sky addressed to all of humanity. I, Louis XIV, am not on the throne. I am the throne. You laugh, you think it's over the top, but you know what's crazier? It worked. Versailles made the nobles come. Once there, they didn't dare leave. Once they left, their own estates felt like college dorms. Versailles was a glittering blade, hypnotic and sharp, peeling away every layer of freedom from the aristocracy with a velvet edge. Versailles was not a palace. Versailles was an endless reality show where every French noble lived like a 17th century influencer. The only difference, instead of live streaming on TikTok, they live streamed through the king's gaze. Louis XIV didn't need you to love him. He just needed you to tremble when he nodded. And so he turned Versailles into a colossal theatre with himself as the director-screenwriter-led actor and the only audience allowed to press like. From the very moment he decided to build Versailles in the middle of a swamp, Louis wasn't choosing land, he was choosing psychology. He didn't build Versailles because Paris lacked room. He built it because Paris had too many nobles with opinions. Louis didn't want debates. He wanted a sandbox where he was the sun and everyone else had to orbit. And so, Versailles rose out of the mud essentially. Louis took the entire nobility and dropped them into a silk-covered survival game show where the rules were the closer you are to the king, the longer you survive. Think you're a Grand Duke with power in your home province? Think again. At Versailles you were just an extra who got the honour of helping the king put on his pants. Yes, pants. One of the highest honours was being allowed to touch Louis's stockings. Some people waited their whole lives just to glimpse his ankle, and once they did, they cried. Not superstition, politics. Each day at Versailles played out in episodes Morning Louis Wakes airs at 7:30 am noon Louis Deans. No one eats, you just watch Evening Louis strolls. If you stand in the sunbeam at the right corridor, you might get screen time. Didn't show up on time out. Wore the wrong colour out. Accidentally glanced too long at the Duchess the king currently favours out and don't come back. Versailles was the only place on earth where the right smile at the king could save your career. But it had to be at the correct angle at the perfect moment and absolutely no teeth, because noble teeth back then, not great. And remember, everything you did was being watched, every gesture evaluated. The king might say nothing, but one bored glance could translate to Duke de la Rochefoucauld weak performance in today's episode. To stay in Versailles, you had to burn money like incense. New gowns every week afternoon, tea-scented candles from Florence, perfumes from Grasse commissioned portraits, lining the staircases, all just for Louis to walk by and mutter, And if he said nothing, death would have been kinder. Because Versailles didn't kill with swords, it killed with silence. The nobles, once tigers on the battlefield, became peacocks, beautiful, useless and noisy on schedule. They had no time to rebel. Too busy picking feather colours and jockeying for the seat closest to the orange tree Louis liked. And did Louis know? Of course. He orchestrated it. Versailles was his game. He made the rules. Far from me, you lose everything. Close to me, you might survive, or slowly die, with a smile. Louis controlled space, but more than anything, he controlled time. He made everyone live by his clock. When he slept, Versailles held its breath. When he walked, Versailles calmed its wind. When he sneezed, France prayed. You no longer lived your own life. You lived his, and called it an honour. There were nobles who once swore never to bow to any man. After 1 week at Versailles, they learned to bow at a 45-degree angle, eyes moist, and never ever look up before the king passed. Men from the cold mountain provinces, voices nasal and stiff. After 3 months, they could name each of the king's chefs and knew precisely how whipped his eggs should be. That was Versailles' power. It didn't need violence. It just needed your desperate willingness. And Versailles succeeded so well, people loved it. They were addicted. Because inside Versailles you might be miserable, but at least you had an audience. Outside you were just a washed-up noble with a forgotten castle. Versailles was dopamine, stage lights, a camera that never stopped rolling, and Louis. He was the spotlight shining on you or pulling back to let you fade. No laws needed, no guillotine. Louis just had to enter a room and 200 people stopped breathing, wondering who he would look at today. This wasn't politics. This was absolute control through the hunger to be seen. Versailles wasn't just a residence. It was an operating system, a power matrix, a parallel world where everyone performed and only one man lived authentically. And you think it all ended when Louis died. Think again. When he passed, Versailles trembled, but it didn't fall, because he had embedded something deeper than architecture, the need to be approved. Even after the lights dimmed, people waited for them to flicker back on, because once you've lived in the sun's glow, you'll spend the rest of your life flying back toward that light, even if it's for the last time, and when you step out of Versailles, the light outside suddenly seems dimmer. not because the sky's cloudy, but because you've just exited an artificial sun. Versailles, a place where Louis didn't need to shout, didn't need to kill, didn't need to argue. He only needed to let you look at him long enough that you'd forget who you were. Versailles was a strange place. Marble on the outside, Greek gods in the garden, chandeliers brighter than the combined brainpower of the entire court. But inside, beneath all that gilded decoration, beat a heart powered by testosterone and ambergris perfume. Versailles wasn't just where the king ruled, it was where he played. And if you think the royal bedroom stories are just gossip, welcome, darling, to season 1 of Keeping Up with Louis XIV, you know Louis XIV, right? Of course you do. And as I've already said, he never waited. Waiting was for mortals. Louis was a god, and gods don't wait, they take. Instantly. While the fountains outside danced to baroque music in the dim stone corridors behind the palace, a little game of chase happened regularly. Servants ran, lovers hid, and Louis walked slowly. Because he knew in the end they'd all surrender. Louise was the first. Not the first ever, but the first official mistress, a title that sounded both romantic and suspiciously like a full-time job without health insurance. She was young nobility, graceful, intelligent, and above all, sincere. Rumour had it she loved Louis for him, not for his throne. And you know what? That drove him absolutely wild. In a palace where everyone pretended there was one girl who blushed and trembled loving him, as if he were just a young man, not the sun god. Too sweet, too spicy, too intoxicating. Louis immediately brought her into Versailles, gave her a room, a title, and a never-ending pass into a world where he could drop by any evening, usually right after supper. But you know Louis, he was not the kind of man who stopped at chapter 1. If Louise de la Vallière was spring-tender and blushing like a freshly opened flower, then Montespan was a thunderstorm hitting Versailles under a clear sky. She didn't knock. She didn't wait for an invitation. She entered as if the palace had been built for her, and everyone knew it except Louis, who figured it out after 3 nights, 1 masquerade ball, and a subtle kick to the shin under the banquet table. Can you imagine a woman kicking the King of France? But no one dared say a thing, because the way she did it, it felt like part of a dance. Her dress billowed like clouds, her eyes sparkled like stormy night skies, and her smile could make 3 footmen faint and make Louis forget he was sitting next to his wife. Montespan didn't ask for Louis's love. She priced it. And what she got wasn't just the king's heart, but Versailles' budget ceremonial power, and almost veto power over palace interior design. You thought Versailles belonged to Louis. During the years she ruled his heart, Versailles was Montespan's house. The windows opened according to her favourite breeze. Breakfast began when she woke never before. The paintings in Louis's chambers all had to be mythological, but absolutely no goddess could be prettier than her. One painter once depicted Venus with a slimmer waist than Montespan, and no one saw him again. Rumour has it, he was reassigned to garden duty. And of course Versailles wasn't just about sunlight and marble, it had beds. And you already know. Louis XIV was not the kind of man who slept alone. Versailles had nearly 400 rooms, but Louis only cared about the one with Montespan inside. Their bed wasn't just for rest, it was the soft centre of France's entire soft power policy. Some nights they discussed art. Some nights they laughed till dawn at her imitations of bowing courtiers. But other nights, many nights, Versailles went quiet as if holding its breath as velvet curtains closed, servant footsteps faded, locks clicked, and then history chose not to write down what followed. They say Louis had the strength of 3 men and Montespan, planned like a field marshal. Every time it was her night, Versailles transformed fresh flowers, chilled wine-scented candles, only amber fragrance the one she liked. Even the incense had to match the exact vibrational frequency of springtime desire. Not a single beat off. The servants called her the Queen without a crown, but in private she was the National Director of Royal Libido, because truly she scheduled managed reviewed appointments, and possibly cancelled them when Louis said something less than charming. They had 7 children together, enough for a mini soccer team with a spare goalkeeper. One day Louis was walking in the gardens calling his kids names, then paused, furrowed his brow. The curly-haired one. What's his name again? Montespan smiled. The name Your Majesty forgot. That's exactly why I should name the next ones myself. You think Louis got angry? No, he laughed. Because no one argues with a storm. You just hold your breath and wait for it to pass. And at Versailles the storm passed, when Montespan was pleased. Under her reign, Versailles became the convergence of poetry scandal, imported lace from Venice and strategic pillow talk. If you wanted to rise in court, you needed her smile. If you wanted peace, never wear the same colour as her gown. There was a nobleman once exiled to the frontier for sitting in her chair or worse, sitting before she arrived. You could hate Montespan, say she was too cunning, too loud, too dramatic, but you couldn't deny this no woman ever bent Versailles to match the curve of her hips quite like she did. And Louis? Louis wasn't controlled, but he allowed himself to be led. Because even the sun knows some nights the most beautiful light doesn't come from the sky, but from a woman laughing softly under candlelight. If Louis XIV's love life was a reality show with flowing silk, endless spotlight, and lovers rotating like seasonal cast members, then Marie-Thérèse was the official character with no screen time. She arrived in France with 12 tons of wedding gifts and 7 hymnals, a peace offering, a diplomatic treaty. She was less a bride than a royal warranty. Louis saw her, married her like someone signing a 99-year land lease, polite, necessary, and entirely unsexy. The new Queen of France didn't make Versailles shift its dinner schedule. She wasn't the kind to have fountains reflowered for mood reasons. No, Marie-Thérèse was devout, simple, and a little shy. In other words, too kind for Versailles. She didn't speak French well, didn't dance, didn't enjoy raunchy court jokes, and unfortunately lacked the magnetic charm required to anchor a man like Louis in a palace drowning in hormones. So what happens when you're queen, and your husband is famously known as the king of midnight visits? You do what Marie-Thérèse did, you look the other way. It's not that she didn't know. At Versailles, if the king sneezed 3 times, the entire court knew he'd been in bed with someone. But Marie-Thérèse accepted it like destiny, as if adultery had been written into the royal constitution. Louis could spend the night elsewhere, but the next morning Marie-Thérèse would still be there, hands folded in the chapel, smiling gently as the priest gave thanks for marital blessings. In fact, every time Louis visited her bed, even if just out of a royal duty, she'd hold a prayer service the next day in gratitude. The whole palace knew, every servant knew, and everyone chuckled quietly. They laughed, but also felt a little sad. They had 6 children together, but only one survived Louis the Grand Dauphin. And perhaps it was that fragility that made her even more silent. She didn't demand, she didn't envy, she didn't curse at Montespan, she didn't cry like Louise. She never lost herself, but she was never allowed to be herself either. In Versailles, where every stone smelled like ambition, Marie-Thérèse was the sigh that disappeared beneath the symphony. Did Louis love his wife in a very Louis way? He respected her, appreciated her patience, and when she died suddenly after a brief illness in 1683, Louis cried, not like he did for mistresses, not like when Versailles changed curtains to match some other woman's mood. This time Versailles was silent. No music, no celebration, no flickering chandeliers, just a man who once had everything sitting alone in a room and no one left to call him husband with sincerity. Perhaps it was in that quiet emptiness that Madame de Maintenon, a woman with nothing but a soft voice, was finally able to walk into the heart of a man who once called himself a god. Marie-Thérèse was not a goddess. She didn't need to be. She was the last person in Louis's life he didn't love to possess, to conquer, or to display. She was simply there, quietly, passing through Versailles like a breeze of dignity cutting through a sultry summer. If Montespan was fire-red velvet thunder and lust, then Madame de Maintenon was a warm teacup after a night of drunken debauchery. Not the kind of thing that thrills you at first, but once you taste it, you want to stay a little longer. Françoise d'Aubigné, her real name, didn't walk into Louis's life under chandeliers and satin gowns or flanked by trumpets. She arrived like a fairy tale stepmother, except the child was the king himself. She was hired to be a tutor, for the illegitimate children Louis had with Montespan. That's right. Maintenon started her Versailles journey by teaching math to the Kingside kids. It wasn't the start of a love story, it was clean-up duty. And what mesmerized Louis, the way she held her pen like a prayer. The way she never looked him straight in the eye, at least not for the first 2 months. Her dignity quiet like lipstick in the wind. No one understood Louis. He already had Versailles, the Sun King title, the most beautiful mistress in France. And suddenly he started attending lessons, first to observe, then to listen. Then one day someone saw him, taking dictation with the kids. Maintenon didn't flirt, didn't ask for favours, didn't play games, but she existed, and Versailles caught a faint scent of morality without the stench of judgment. No one knows exactly when Louis fell in love, only that when Montespan began to crumble, Maintenon was already there, book in hand, eyes still not rushing, not reaching as if love would arrive if you just sat up straight. And it did. When Marie-Thérèse died, Versailles waited for a new woman, someone dazzling, radiant, public. Instead, Louis quietly married Maintenon in secret. No gala, no invitations, no wedding cake. Just whispered vows by the flicker of a blue candle. They called her the Queen without a crown, but even she didn't claim a throne. She didn't demand a private wing, didn't request monthly portraits, didn't ask Versailles to repaint its tiles to match her mood. She only asked Louis to stay. They say the king's bed, once a playground of politics and passion, became a sanctuary of scripture after Maintenon. They talked. A lot. They prayed. Regularly. And sometimes they just sat beside each other saying nothing at all. You think that's boring. But to a man who had lived like an entire universe spinning around himself, silence was the final, ultimate form of power. Versailles under Maintenon played fewer tunes, poured less wine, and moaned less behind closed curtains. Instead, it housed schools for poor noble girls. It had libraries, and nights where the king no longer needed sedatives to fall asleep. You didn't see her. But Versailles softened, and when Louis aged with aching legs, missing teeth, and wars dragging on who sat beside him each night placing warm towels on his knees, reading letters from subjects and never mentioning those who once shared that same room. It was her, not dazzling but unshakable, and perhaps that's why Maintenon was the true final chapter of Louis, because only she could make him realise being a king is one thing, but having someone who lets you not be king, that's eternal. When Louis XIV died on September 1st, 1715, France didn't just lose a king, Versailles lost its gravitational centre. 70-plus years of reign so long that 3 generations of nobles were born, lived and died without knowing a world without Louis. They called him the sun, but he was more than that. He was time, heartbeat, biological clock and psychological metronome for the entire court. So when he closed his eyes, everything hushed. Like a stage gone black, the dazzling lights of Versailles didn't turn off immediately, but they began to flicker, and then fade. His body was placed in the grand hall beneath a dome he'd redesigned 3 times because the light wasn't yet worthy of the divine glow God gave me. People lined up until their legs gave out just to see a corpse they had never dared look at directly in life. Some wept, some pretended to, some rejoiced silently, bowing deeper than usual. Versailles still echoed with music. There were still curtsies and mirrored reflections of silk and powdered wigs. But something had cracked. Not the gold, not the marble. Something deeper. Versailles had no king. In 7 decades, Louis XIV didn't just build monuments. He built a religion with himself as prophet. In that world, desire was a ritual. Mistresses were saints, and his body, its lust and its aches became sacred symbols. Historians call him a tyrant, a political genius, a master of ceremonialism. But few dare say this plainly, he was also a sexual genius. Not because he had many lovers, but because he understood this sex is power. It's what kept Versailles sleepless. It was the loyalty test, the glittering reward, and the honeyed punishment. From Louise de la Vallière, the first trembling with springtime innocence, still shaky when stepping into the royal bedchamber, to Madame de Montespan, thunderous and proud, who could make Versailles change its entire menu because she tired of the food, and finally Madame de Maintenon, whispering veiled in either real or carefully performed virtue, but the only one who made Louis go to bed early and stop inspecting the physical well-being of the female court. Louis's sexuality wasn't instinct. It was infrastructure, a policy, a message encrypted into every masquerade ball, every hand-painted portrait left forgotten in sitting rooms, every child born legitimate or otherwise. And Versailles was the canvas. Every hallway, every mirror, every carved bed frame bore traces of a romance past or imminent. No one could tell where diplomacy ended and foreplay began. In Versailles, everything funneled into one question. Did Louis look at you? Did he touch you? Did he choose you, even temporarily, to orbit him? When he was gone, that question vanished. The algorithm broke. Versailles was left holding a math problem with the central variable missing, and no one wanted to solve the rest. Louis had died, but his death felt like the sunset in a painting, too beautiful to be the end, too symbolic to be real. Courtiers still wandered the halls slowly, still wore gloves the way he liked, still whispered about that last evening where he looked at Maintenon just a bit longer than usual. Some swore they heard his footsteps echo at night. Versailles after Louis was like a reality show suddenly cancelled without warning. The side characters kept gathering, putting on makeup, reading the old scripts, but the audience had gone home. Everyone had fallen asleep, except Versailles. It stayed awake, its lights still on, Wind still rustling the fountains no one admired anymore. Louis XIV didn't just leave behind a palace. He left behind a system of thought where power didn't shout, it merely looked. Where desire wasn't hidden beneath bedsheets, but rolled out like a red carpet to be walked on, to rule to remember. Versailles was the dream of a man who believed he was a god, and France for over 70 years lived in that dream, willingly, frightened, enchanted, or quietly enduring it. When Louis died, they woke up. But like waking from a dream too beautiful, no one really wanted to open their eyes. And the most terrifying part, Versailles still stands, still beautiful, still magnificent, still as dangerous as a smile from Louis. The only difference, no one today shines bright enough to make it come alive again,